Hi, welcome to the Shepherd Podcast. I'm your host. I'm Pastor Chris. Thank you for joining us. The podcast is a way to acquaint you with people at Shepherd of the Hills, our church, school, and childcare. So many wonderful people for you to get to know, and it's my privilege to be able to introduce many of them to you. And today is a person I'm very excited to spend some time with. He's had a fascinating career in ministry and is just a great person to get to know. And so today I'd like to welcome to the podcast Pastor Keith Fox. Pastor Keith, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Now I'd like to talk, as we were visiting beforehand, we could probably have a different episode for every stage of your career. You've had a lot of variety in your career. So we'll try to give people just an overview and get into a few topics in particular, but just to give people an idea of what's ahead. I mean, you've served in a variety of capacities from parish pastor to hospital chaplain to district executive to serving at a church in Germany for 8 summers. And so you've done a lot of different things. Could you give us just an overview of your timeline in ministry?
Okay. We've got plenty of time, hopefully. Yeah, it's, as I thought about it this past week, my ministry has been kind of a zigzag kind of thing. I've gone from one thing to another, almost as if I was one of these guys that didn't know what he wanted to do with his life. But my first call out of seminary was to Fort Worth, Texas.
Right.
And that was a total shock. I grew up in Michigan. I interned vicared in Fargo, North Dakota. The placement interview, the only question of any significance was, would you mind going to Canada? So I just figured I was heading north. And when I opened the envelope and it said Fort Worth, Texas, it kind of blew me away.
Wow, what a surprise.
And the only thing I knew about Texas was our family had crossed the Panhandle once on a vacation, and I had seen the cowboy movies with the bars and the guns and all that.
Right.
But it was such a pleasant surprise when I got to Fort Worth, and it was a real place, a nice place.
Yeah.
But from there, my call was to Austin, Texas, to a parish there. And the interesting thing about that was that there were 12 clergy in the congregation. The district office was located there, Concordia College, and a number of professors at UT. And so on any Sunday, I had 8 or 10 clergy that I was out there preaching to.
Wow.
So that's when I started working hard on my sermons.
Oh, yeah, you had to. A lot of pressure.
Another interesting thing, just briefly while we were there, Marilyn and I, my wife, and our Minister of Education and Youth were commissioned by CPH to do a film strip series for a Lenten series. And that was really an interesting thing to do. And of course, people nowadays may not even know what a film strip is, but we entitled it Journey to Joy, and it was doing it was a journey to joy. But from Austin, then I after 5 years there, I resigned and went to Austin State Hospital for clinical pastoral education, which is a learning by relationship and learning as much, if not anything more, about yourself and how to deal with people. And it can be a pretty stressful kind of learning, too, because a lot of introspection. While I was there, I was supported by the Texas District and Lutheran Social Service while I was in that training, with the understanding that I would do something with them when I was finished with the year. Wound up going to Houston and opening a counseling, marriage and family counseling center. I had, while in my first parish, I had started a master's degree in counseling, and so that all, with the CPE, gave me the tools that I needed for that ministry. That office ballooned into working with adoptions and unwed mothers, and in fact, it became a larger operation than the mother office in Austin after a while. But then we had some problems. The executive director got us, some things happened that we had to, financially, the agency got in trouble, so we had to close that office. And so I moved over. Oliver Harms, who had been president of the Synod, had just retired. They were building a Lutheran pavilion at MD Anderson Cancer Hospital, and he was kind of working with that. So I moved into the office with him and finished out some of my counseling, and then moved in as chaplain at MD Anderson.
Yeah.
And so I was there for 4 years and began training to become a supervisor. And at one point came over here to San Antonio for a presentation on death and dying to a ladies thing, reconnected with a friend that I had worked with in Austin, a fellow pastor, ALC pastor, and got excited about his ministry and wound up seeing what I could do to get put on the call list, because I was ready to get back into the parish. The CPE supervisory stuff, I wound up, it was just 4 students, me and 4 students, and I wasn't getting out with people.
Yeah.
And so when this opportunity to get back in the parish kind of popped up, I thought, that's where I belong. And so I did get the call there, and the ministry there, we might want to talk about it a little more later, but just a lot of community stuff that I got involved with there.
Right.
Being there 5 years, the assistant to the bishop resigned, and a call went out to for people who might be qualified and interested. Well, I felt qualified, but I knew nothing. At that point, let me back up just a second. At that point, I had moved from Missouri Synod to ALC, and that was possible because we were in fellowship at that point.
Right.
And so it was a very simple transition. The 2 district presidents, who I knew personally, just said, yeah, it's okay. And so I was at that point in the ALC. And after, I guess it was 5 years, the assistant to the district president resigned. A call went out for people. And I felt I was qualified, but I knew nothing about the ALC. I just knew what was going on in my little realm.
Right.
And so I didn't even bother. Then a friend urged me to apply, and I wound up being called to that position for 5 years. And then the ELCA came into being. And so the American Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church in America, and the group that had broken away from Missouri came together in 1988 and formed the ELCA, which meant that I was then out of a job. But I was the guy who put names into congregations for calls. And so I was in a position where I could put my name in anywhere I wished.
Okay.
But right about that time, the LCA district president came and asked, have you thought about House of Prayer in San Antonio? I said, I don't even know anything about House of Prayer in San Antonio. He said, well, it's a congregation that's been having a lot of problems. And he said, I've sent them over a dozen names. They've interviewed many people. None of them would touch it with a 10-foot pole.
You said, sounds great.
Yeah, that's just what I'm looking for.
Right.
But I got to thinking, my training is this kind of thing. While in the district office, I had worked with placement of pastors and families in crisis and conflict and congregational conflict. Right. So that was kind of where I had been for some time anyway. Yeah. And so I said, go ahead, put my name in, and I wound up with the call to House of Prayer. Yeah. And that's just down the road, just
right.
Across Highway 10.
Yeah, on Wurzbach.
Yeah, on Wurzbach. Yeah. So we were neighbors.
Yeah.
I knew Dan. Of course, we had bump into each other time to time, but I was ELCA, he was Missouri, and so we didn't have that much going on, at that time. But I wound up retiring then from House of Prayer in 2000, and then the next year I spent in Germany, and so it's been a wild ride, but the Lord, there's no question in my mind that the Lord was guiding me to get the training, to do the things I needed to do to be where I was going to be next. It's just really wonderful. Yeah.
You mentioned Germany. Now there's more of a story there too, in that you served in Frankfurt. Was it for 8 summers?
Well, that was the first of all, when I was getting ready to retire, I contacted, a friend of mine had gone to the church in Frankfurt as a assistant pastor. They always had 2 pastors at that church, and the church had started right after the Second World War because there were so many military over there, and so it was made up of military people and civilians, because there are a lot of civilians that live over there. And a friend of mine he followed me as pastor at Hope in Austin, and when he retired a couple years before I did, and he went over to Frankfurt for a year. When he came back, he said, "Keith, you need to check that out." And the setup was that the ELCA would provide a pastor for 6 years, and then the Missouri Synod would provide one for 6 years.
Oh, interesting.
So he finished up the 6 years with the Missouri, and so ELCA was taken over, and I was there at that point. So I contacted the National Office of Mission Board and said, I'm interested in this year program over in Frankfurt. They said, well, you're number 12 on the list. And I said, oh, well, what else have you got? I said, I've still got time and energy and want to do ministry. I just felt a need to retire at the point when I did.
Yeah.
And so I waited around. Eventually they sent me a offer to go to Czechoslovakia to train for a year to learn the language and then teach in the seminary there.
Wow.
And I said, no, that's not what I'm not ready to do that.
That would have been a lot.
Oh, it would have. I was ready to do more ministry, but not get that into that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, about March, I retired in June. About March, I got a phone call, and I had told him I wasn't interested in Czechoslovakia, but keep looking for something, of a shorter term. I got a call in March, and they asked, "Are you still interested in Frankfurt?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And they said, "Well, they're having problems there. The new pastor who came 6 months ago has got some real turmoil stirred up over there. And looking over the resumes, look like you're the best person for us to send."
Well, this sounds like deja vu with the House of Prayer. They're having trouble. Would you like to serve there?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So went over, and as with House of Prayer, it was a beautiful ministry, beautiful people. Yeah. You've been in ministry long enough to know that there's always something going on in the congregation. You never have 100% of the people who are happy with you as a pastor.
Right.
And but I got over to Frankfurt, and they were the most wonderful people. Marilyn and I just had the time of our life.
Oh, great.
I preached every other Sunday, and there wasn't much going on during the week because the congregation came from all over. Right. And the part of the thing that really made it an interesting ministry was that the congregation wasn't just Lutherans. It was interdenominational. The year I was there, the congregational president was Roman Catholic.
Oh, really?
And the council members were Methodist and Presbyterian and Lutheran. It was a place for Christians to come together.
Huh.
And it was just one of the most unique ministries that you could imagine. Yeah. And we didn't worry that much we didn't worry at all about denomination. A lot of the time I had no idea what people's backgrounds were.
Yeah.
But then we got there in August, and in December, the pastor announced that he was resigning in June. And he hadn't bothered to tell me he was going to do that. But so immediately, things started shifting a little bit, and I started doing more of the ministry. And, well, of course, then the folks said, well, you've got to stay on and finish out his 6 years. And I said, well, I don't think I can pull that off. I would have loved to, but we had our house sitting here, closed up, and there would have been just so much to do.
Yeah.
And one Sunday morning, at the end of the service, a group of people were in the back of the church, and they held up 2 by 3 foot poster boards, and they all had written on 4 more years. 4 more years.
How funny! That's great.
And we really did struggle with the possibility, of staying there.
Yeah.
Because it was such a delightful place, and every country was within a couple hours driving distance practically.
Right.
And the ministry there, they were still doing some ministry to military. We had a place in Belgium, a place in Italy, and a place in Germany. Actually, just 3 places, and the other pastor and I would rotate going to those once a month, have confirmation instruction if there were kids there.
Yeah.
And on those trips, would go, and then we would just do some side trip for a couple days, and
that sounds really nice.
It was really nice.
Wow, what a great experience.
Yeah.
As we're talking, I think of lots of different questions that come to mind just based on our conversation. One is thinking about going into 2 different situations where you were told ahead of time, there's some turmoil here and we need some help getting things straightened out. What were some of the things that you tried to accomplish? What was your game plan going into situations where you knew going into it that there'd been some conflict? What were the things that you wanted to do to bring health to those situations, and how did you go about doing that?
I think the main thing I did was going in saying, I'm going to love these people, and the love will come back. And, the turmoil was between, in most cases, was between parishioners. That not always. The Frankfurt situation was the pastor there had been a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and he couldn't get beyond his military. he had to be totally in charge, and that caused some conflict. But mainly, I've always believed in people and their ability to be the best they can, their desire to be good, faithful people, particularly Christians.
Right.
And so I just would go in with the assumption that things are going to be great here. And they were.
Wow.
I mean, it wasn't as if I didn't have turmoil at times. And House of Prayer, there were some folks, and I realized that going in, and I kind of identified, what folks that were going to give me some problems, because they had been behind the 2 pastors that had been there before I came. The one, they had just terminated his salary, so he had to leave.
Oh yeah, I guess so.
And the other one, they were in doing a fund drive for a major building program, and he accepted a call to Tulsa. So the things were not real good there. That's why the LCA district president had said they've got some turmoil there.
Yeah, I can see that.
But we had some bumps along the way. in Frankfurt, we didn't have any bumps. It was just really joyful ministry. But overall, I wound out my ministry with real celebration of what had been there here at House of Prayer. So.
Yeah. You go into those situations, being told ahead of time you may have some challenges. For you, what ended up being your most challenging assignment looking back on your career? Was there one season of ministry that you felt was harder than the others?
Probably the most challenging was being in the district office because I went in Texas. Most of the pastors, I found out after a while, had gone to Texas Lutheran. Many of them had gone there at the same time. It was a good old buddy deal. Oh. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody covered for everybody. And so when I got in there, the district president, I went into the office, spent 2 weeks with the district president, then he left for 3 weeks to go to Mexico for intensive language training. Oh. And so in 2 weeks, I was on my own, and he said, whatever decisions you make, I will stand behind.
Oh, okay.
And so I said, okay. The very first place I went to as far as conflict was a situation where a pastor had an affair with one of the members.
Oh, no.
And so I went out there and I said, well, you have 3 weeks to inform the congregation that you're leaving, and we will give you some help, because we did have a process set up for assisting clergy who got into some kind of trouble, clergy and families. Yeah. And I came back to the office, and the other 2 staff people, I told them what I'd run into, and they said, Keith, you don't have that kind of authority to tell a guy to resign. I said, well, I didn't know that, and he didn't know that, so he'll be leaving. But the conflict situations were troubling. So often the stuff was of no consequence, or of very little consequence, at least from my perspective. But I set up a process of working through. I would interview individual. I would go and spend like 2 days, have the secretary set up half-hour slots, 8 in the morning to 6 in the evening, for congregation members to come in and voice their concerns. Wow. And I would take notes on it.
That's a long day.
A long day.
Yeah.
And at the end of that, I would meet with the church council. I would tell them what I had heard and ask them, okay, how do we resolve this? And usually we were able to work things through and find a resolution. Yeah. In most cases, they would lose a few members because people tend to be pretty firm in their positions. But going in, I guess 75% of my time was spent with conflict intervention, and so that was the more stressful thing. Yeah. And I know when the ELCA was formed, a number of folks asked about my running for bishop, and I said, no, thank you.
No, thank you. I've had my share.
I've done my duty in that area.
Yeah.
Because, it was the bishop and I that were, constantly working together, but most of it was on my shoulders.
Wow. That's a lot of responsibility. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to touch on is you were involved in some very important initiatives here in San Antonio that people would be familiar with. I would think Christian Assistance Ministry is familiar to most of our members. Mm-hmm. You were involved in getting that started, as well as SAMM, S-A-M-M, and Grace Place, which may not be as familiar. Could you at least speak to the story behind how CAM got started and your involvement there?
Yeah, I guess I had been in San Antonio less than a year, and we were constantly having families and individuals coming by the church needing help, and almost always very legitimate needs. And we had money in the budget for that, but a limited amount, really. And I got to talking with other pastors, and we kind of realized that people were going from church to church to church and getting assistance.
Right.
And so we said, well, why don't we do something about this? So 5 of us got together one afternoon, and that's where we kind of fermented the idea of Christian Assistance Ministry. Mm-hmm. We said if we could get all the downtown churches to cooperate and put together a ministry where when people came to our congregation, we could say, well, we have this ministry we can that will serve you. Yeah. And so, and fortunately, Grace had just the year before I got there had purchased the Salvation Army property, which was a building that Cam is still in, right, and a warehouse and an older kind of a mansion, a Dolnik house it was called. Okay. And so I said, hey, we've got a place, because the buildings were just sitting there, mm-hmm, and they were talking about using it as a youth building, but we had hardly any youth. Okay. The congregation, when I went there, the median age was 67, I think. Okay. And part of my ministry there was visiting shut-ins. We had 82 shut-ins that I visited.
82 shut-ins?
I averaged 5 a week and visited everybody once a month.
Wow.
But anyway, wow, back to Cam. So we got together. We brought all the clergy from most of the downtown churches. First Baptist already had a program where they were ministering to street people and doing some ministry there. St. Mark's Episcopal had a full-time pastor doing community ministry. Well, he became part of our group. In fact, our first meeting was with him. And so eventually we decided, well, we were all going to go back to our congregations. We needed to provide staff to begin with, at least a director and a couple social workers. Okay. And we had the building. We had to do some renovation, but we all went back, and I don't remember what kind of dollar figures we went back asking for, but we all came through and got it off the ground. And so it was there to provide food and clothing for families and for individuals. Mm-hmm. A lot of street people, homeless people, yeah, and there we would provide clothing as needed, and then they could come, and this is still part of the program, they could come every day for a sack lunch. And so that ministry was started 42 years ago. It's still going.
Still going strong.
Yeah, going strong. Yeah, there are 87 churches in San Antonio that are now a part of CAM.
Really? Wow. That's cool.
The reason I know that, I just got a flyer with a bunch of statistics. Yeah. And they served 56,000 people last year.
Wow.
And so our idea was that there are resources, state and city resources available to people, mm-hmm, but when they get caught all of a sudden in a crunch time, right, and until they can get processed, and the processing to get financial aid can take 6 months or more for people. And so we saw ourselves as a stopgap to boost that ministry along. And so it's been exciting. And I was, just a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking back to the beginnings and the group of 10 pastors that started this. And to my knowledge, I'm the only one still alive.
Oh, okay.
In fact, I got an email just a couple days ago entitled, "I'm as old as dirt." I said, that fits. But yeah, that was a blessing, that ministry. The SAM ministry came about because the 10 of us met every other Tuesday for morning breakfast to see how things were going.
Yeah.
And one of the fellows brought a newspaper, and the front page said, "Man freezes to death under bridge, under I-35." And we said, that should never happen.
Yeah.
And so that's when we started. Actually, I started at First Presbyterian. We used their gymnasium, filled it with mattresses, and then we had people could check in at a certain time. We would have sandwiches and a cup of soup for them when they checked in.
Oh, wow.
They could spend the night and leave in the morning. Eventually, the city made available a deserted hotel on the west side of downtown, and local lumberyards and all provided materials to refurbish it. The military came in and did the work.
Wow.
And put Sam into being.
Wow. Wow.
Grace Place was at Grace Lutheran, and this is, I don't know why I got the idea, but somewhere along the line I realized that there were families that had older parents that they were trying to care for at their home and still work. And so came up with the idea of a senior adult daycare program. Mm-hmm. And as with so many of the things I came up with, there was immediate resistance. We don't want our building used for old people. We had an education building that wasn't being used.
Yeah.
And that program just took off like crazy. It was just a real need, and people could drop their parent off and go to work, pick them up, go home in the evening. Uh-huh. And let me just toss out a couple other things. I got a phone call one day from Alcoholics Anonymous, and they said, "We have been put out of our space. Would you happen to have any room?" Well, we had the basement of the CAM building that we're not using. I said, "Yeah, we've got space." So they put up a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week AA center there with a man on site all the time. Wow. Got a phone call from Narcotics Anonymous. Didn't even know that existed. "Could you provide us some meeting space?" "Yeah, we've got some extra room in that basement." So we put them in there. Wow. Got a phone call from Lutheran Social Service. Said, "We're looking for office space." Well, we had that Dolnig house. And I said, "Well, let me check." And so they moved in there.
Wow.
And the interesting thing about that house is that Dr. Dolnig, who had been a member of Grace at one time and was at that time teaching in some university, but he's the one that patented Gatorade, the drink,
Yeah.
So my 5 years at Grace were just a blur in a sense, but exciting community ministry.
Wow, that is really unique.
Yeah.
And a lot of that still ongoing today. Very much a ministry of compassion, and people knew who to call when they needed space.
Yeah, I guess they did.
And you came through. That's really great. Yeah. I could probably ask about another 100 questions about your ministry. I just think it's so fascinating, all the things you've done. But I do always want to help people to get to know our guests on a personal level as well. So would love to turn the corner there and just talk a little bit about your family. Can you tell us a little bit about Marilyn and the rest of your family?
Yeah. Marilyn and I met... let me get a drink.
Yeah. I'm making you do all the work right now with the talking. There's just so much to talk about.
Marilyn and I met in Fort Wayne, Indiana at Concordia Junior College, which no longer exists. But I had gone to a Wisconsin Synod prep school 30 miles from home, and then went down to Concordia. Marilyn lived in Fort Wayne and dated my two roommates, and then finally found the right guy.
Okay, third time's the charm.
Right. And we got married before my vicarage year in Fargo, North Dakota. And just a sidelight, we went on our honeymoon with another couple, my sister and her husband.
Well, how romantic.
They were married 3 months before we were, around Easter time, and we were all dirt cheap. I mean, poor, dirt poor.
Yeah, yeah.
But we decided we were going to take this honeymoon trip. My dad had a new Buick, and he had built a camper that opened up with a tent over it. And so we went on a 23-day trip throughout the West
How fun.
in a tent. 2 newlywed couples. But we had our privacy because we hung a sheet in between the two beds.
Well, that took care of it.
Right. But
wow, how memorable.
we decided we'd probably never do that again. Our first child, our daughter Bethany, was born in Fort Worth at our first parish. The 2 boys were born in Austin when we were there, and they have both gone on to have real interesting careers. Our daughter was with Southwest Airlines for almost 20 years, which gave us parental privileges. We could fly anywhere. Southwest flew
How nice.
for nothing.
How nice.
Her boss, who was the head, she was one of Kelleher's secretaries, and he would just sign a pad of passes. And so anytime we wanted to go somewhere, we went out to the airport, gave him a pass, and got on the plane.
Wow, what a perk.
It was. But we were, of course, Marilyn was really a very big part of my ministry. She was an organist, and so she got called to duty quite often. Yeah. She was a real Bible scholar, probably as well versed in the Bible as I was. And in fact, I always loved to have her in my Bible classes because I could remember Bible verses, but not where they were.
Right.
She remembered where they were, and that was helpful.
Yes.
And she was a good Bible class teacher, too. We, several of the congregation, we went through the Bethel Bible series, and she took that along with but we had a really interesting, fun life. We did a lot of traveling. Of course, on Southwest Airlines, a lot of it.
Very nice.
But once we had the Frankfurt connection, we spent a lot of time in Europe. You mentioned the 8 summers. I didn't stay there for the 4 years, but the pastor who came in, whose name was Wolf, so Wolf followed a fox, which was kind of interesting.
That's great.
But we connected immediately, and part of the deal was he was considered a missionary and would get 4 weeks off one summer and 6 weeks the next. And so we made an arrangement that when he left on leave, I would go over. We would move into the parsonage, drive the church car, and I'd take care of the ministry during that time. And then we would take off and tour different parts of Europe.
Oh, how nice.
So I mean, talk about a rich blessing.
Really? Yeah. Well, it's been an interesting journey, and the journey continues with your involvement here. I want to thank you for all you do to serve at Shepherd, you and Marilyn both. And thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. This has been a lot of fun.
Well, it's been a lot of talking on my part.
And we only scratched the surface, I feel like.
Well, there are a few more things, but thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome.
I enjoyed being here.
You're very welcome. Okay. And thank you all for watching and listening to our podcast today. You got to hear about a very interesting life in ministry and how God was weaving all that together. And in your life, too, God is weaving together a story. And so the Lord's blessings to you. Please watch next time as we continue to bring great people from Shepherd of the Hills to your attention for you to get to know them better. And the Lord's blessings to you. May He keep you safe and healthy. And we'll see you next time. God's peace.